Welcome, everybody, to the very first tennis-worthy podcast brought to you by the International Tennis Hall of Fame. I'm Brett Haber, and I'm excited to kick off this inspiring new podcast that will bring you conversations with Hall of Famers and tennis legends that go beyond their on-court results. Each year, the International Tennis Hall of Fame celebrates the sport's greatest players and contributors by presentation of tennis's ultimate honor, Hall of Fame induction. This exclusive recognition represents the sum of a person's career as being truly at the top of the game, the best of the best. As we are dedicated to preserving tennis history and celebrating those incredible champions, we frequently ponder the question of what makes a Hall of Famer? What is that unique something that led to their historic success? Was it innate, or did they need to cultivate a winning mindset? Answering these questions and more is what the Tennis Worthy podcast aims to do. Chris Bowers, an esteemed tennis journalist of more than 3 decades and biographer of Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, will be chatting with our legendary guests here on Tennis Worthy. And first up, just ahead of the Australian Open, is the most recent inductee into the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and someone you might say bleeds green and gold, Aussie great Lleyton Hewitt.
That never say die attitude won me so many matches that I probably wouldn't have won under different circumstances. I felt like at that age that, you could run through a brick wall and then the next day you'd be fine. In terms of a ball striking match, I don't know if I've ever hit the ball better. To start number one for a whole year is it's not easy because there's a target on your back every single week. I've always loved the history of the sport, and to somehow have had a small part in that now is something really special.
Lleyton, as you know, is a 2-time major champion, finished back-to-back years at number 1 in the world, helped lead Australia to 2 Davis Cup crowns. But it's his deep intensity, his unrelenting drive, and never-say-die attitude to which Lleyton attributes his success. You'll hear about that and what it was like to grow up amongst a family of very successful Aussie rules players, and how pride for country was instilled in him. And, of course, that come on that he was so famous for. Where'd that come from, and how did it help him on the court on his path to winning? I'll leave you now with Chris Bowers and Lleyton Hewitt. Chris, take it away.
Lleyton Hewitt, what do you think it is that makes you a Hall of Famer? What quality, what aspect, what do you think the biggest thing is that elevates you above the rest?
Well, I don't know about elevates me above the rest, but I think my never say die attitude, always getting the most out of myself, that gave me the best chance to get the success that I was able to get on the court. That never say die attitude won me so many matches that I probably wouldn't have won under different circumstances, I guess, and just having that inner belief as well. Tennis is not just about hitting a ball over the net. So many players can do that, and if you look at the top 200, 300 players in the world, there's very little that separates them in terms of ball striking. So there's a lot more that goes into being a tennis player. I think the physical demands, but also the mental demands as well, and trying to have as close to the perfect whole package as possible.
Where did those two things, the belief, the never say die attitude, where did they come from?
I'm not really sure. A lot of people ask me, the competitive juices, where did that come from? I can't put my finger on it. Obviously, something must be in the genes. I came from a sporting background, whether that had something to do with it. Australian rules football was what I prided myself on. That's what I wanted to play as a young kid growing up. Even when I first started having tennis lessons, I still wanted to play AFL football. My father, grandfather and uncle all played it professionally. That's what I'd go and watch every weekend. And I love the team aspect of it as well. But AFL football is it's a tough sport, and it's a brutal sport, and there's nowhere to hide. And in a lot of ways, that's how my mindset was to tennis. And I think that in some crazy fashion, that's how I brought the competitive side of that to tennis, and that's how I played it.
Did you pick up some of the locker room mentality through your dad and your uncle and your grandfather?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess AFL football's seen in a lot of ways as you don't show anything. You don't show anyone if you're injured. You don't show anyone if you're hurt. And it doesn't matter how much pain you're going through, you're going to keep fighting and find a way. And a lot of that you do that because you've got teammates on the sideline that you don't want to let down, obviously. In tennis, it's not like that, but I think 100% that's where a lot of things came from for me. But also my love for Davis Cup and playing in any kind of team aspect 100% came from not being able to play AFL football. That was probably the one thing that I missed the most about playing tennis. It's great that you're in control of your own destiny on a tennis court and there's nowhere to hide because it's just a one-on-one battle and no one can help you once you're out there. But it's also, I love doing it for your mates and your captain and coach on the sideline. And I think, when you do have success, it means a lot more when you can celebrate with those people.
We'll come back to team sports in a minute, but was there a point where you were aware in a tennis context that you had a lot stronger competitive instinct than many of the other kids around you?
I'm not sure. I think in juniors, even the under-14s when I went over to Europe, it was my second trip to Europe. The first year I went and I was a year out of my age group. The second year I went and won 3 out of the 4 tournaments over there and played on clay, European clay, which we never play on in Australia. We grew up on hard courts. So in terms of that and just my competitiveness and passion and leaving it all on the court, I still remember times in that junior tour where I did that and I felt like I did it better than a lot of the other kids at that age group. And that's something that sort of continued on, and it's probably one of the main reasons why I was able to have that self-belief and drive to be able to make the transition from juniors to seniors very quickly as well at the age of 15 or 16 and have success against older, bigger guys and basically men when I was still just a kid at the time.
Were you tall as a child? Because you ended up at what, 180, 5'11"?
5'10" and a half. Yeah, 5'10" and a half. Just I'd like to say 5'11", but probably just under. But no, I was always on the smaller side in juniors as well.
And did that add extra to your competitive instinct?
Potentially a little bit. Because I knew I probably wasn't going to have the biggest weapons out there, so I had to work on other areas and make those areas very strong, physically, mentally. A lot of those areas, though, are things that you control, whereas there's certain parts of a tennis game that you can't control. A lot depends on how well your opponent serves on a particular day. I can return unbelievably well, but if they hit their spots on their serve, then it's going to be awfully hard for me to do a lot about that. Physically and mentally, they're two things that you can control going into a match. And so I think that always helped me because I felt like at a lot of times, especially at my best, then I probably had a lot of the other competitors covered in those areas.
Did you ever develop a mindset of it's them against me, it's them against us, the way Jimmy Connors was encouraged to believe that they're out to get you, Jimmy?
Yeah. Certainly at times I did. Probably used that more in that mindset in Davis Cup, to be honest, and probably in away ties when you're playing and you've got people screaming against you and you really just have to focus on your player bench and your captain and coach on the side of the court. Apart from, it was sort of our backs against the wall kind of mentality, which is something I liked. But also, I was a big fan of the Rocky movies growing up as well. And so there were certain times when I'd twist it in my mind that that was the situation I'd been put in, and I enjoyed that. And some of my greatest victories in Davis Cup were those away ties when the chips are down and you've got to find a way to somehow pull through, and that's about bonding together with your teammates as well.
There was one away tie in Florianopolis where you beat Gustavo Kuerten and you didn't even realise you'd won it.
Yeah, that whole weekend was a bit surreal, to be honest. We had police escorts from the resort we were staying in, which was about 50 minutes away from the courts, and I just remember we had Brazilians on the side of the road when we were driving, just booing and screaming and throwing stuff at our vans, and we'd get to the courts and just have the police escorts walking around with us, security everywhere. And to go out there and play Guga, who was, won the French Open a couple of times by then, I think. He was world number 1, defending French Open champion. And we kind of came out with a game plan that we had to really focus on beating Melangini, who was a very complete clay court player in his own right. We had to focus on winning those 2 singles and then obviously the doubles. But then it got to a stage where we were 2-1 up going into that 4th match, and I got to play Gustavo in the 4th match. That was like his backyard as well, where he grew up in Florianopolis. And I was able to win in straight sets somehow on a very slow clay court, which obviously wasn't my favourite surface. And probably go down as one of my greatest matches of all time, to be honest. And to do it in those conditions and, to have Fitzy on the sideline with me and be able to enjoy it with my teammates, a guy like Pat Rafter, who was a guy I idolised growing up and was like an older brother to me that really took me under my wing. There was something pretty special about that tie.
Do you remember what you were thinking when you had those Brazilian fans booing your bus? Was there a conscious thing of, right, they are not going to emerge victorious from this?
Yeah, part of it. There's no doubt that probably switched me on in a lot. They sort of stoked the bear in a lot of ways. I was probably, when I was at my best, especially, I was probably, not the right person to be doing that to, because it just made me more determined to either prove people wrong or to go out there and compete and just not let it happen. And that was certainly one of those situations. The same thing happened in my first match in the 2000 Davis Cup final in Barcelona against Albert Costa as well, where I won in 5 sets that day. And, they'd had public enemy number one was my face on the front of the newspaper on the morning of that match. So, just little things like that. But, I had unbelievable captains as well. I had John Newcombe in that time, and then obviously Fitzy in Brazil. But, Nuke was unbelievable at motivating players and being able to get the best out of them. And he certainly knew my personality and what was going to work for me.
But some players in those situations can become so determined that they're not going to let that kind of intimidation win, that they don't play their best. What allows you to play your best in those circumstances?
Yeah, there's something about switching on my focus, I think, and at that stage, I was able to stay focused. And, even though as much as people saw me get pumped up on the court, sometimes in those environments, I actually didn't get as pumped up. It would just be a small amount of emotion to the side bench, and I would only naturally get fired up on an absolute crucial stage that I felt like I needed to, which was going to help me. And so in a lot of ways, I tried to take the crowd out of it in those matches and just focus on what I needed to. But yeah, you can either sink or swim in those occasions. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, the true test of the old Davis Cup format was in 5-set battles. When you're not just playing for yourself, you're playing for a lot more important things than going out and just playing for your surname.
Did you ever doubt yourself at any stage in your career? Did you ever think, I wonder whether I've got enough to really make it?
Oh, at certain stages, you absolutely doubt yourself. For me, it was probably after winning Adelaide the first year as a 16-year-old, and I'd qualified for the Australian Open the year before, but it was a pretty lonely year on tour that first year as a 16-year-old. I didn't have a tour coach, so my dad stopped his job in finance and just travelled with me, so I had someone travelling with me and looking after me on the tour that first year. And you don't relate to a lot of the people. I was fortunate that I had some older Aussie guys, not just on the singles, but on the double circuit as well. And they would sort of play doubles with me in the odd tournament and at least practice sessions and stuff like that. But there's certain stages throughout that year I had to play a lot of qualifying at events and a lot of challenges. And even though I was only 16, I think people think after I won Adelaide that first time that just naturally you're just on tour. It just happens. But I was still ranked. I only went to 170 or something in the world. Like, it wasn't like I'd cracked into every Grand Slam major in the main draw at that stage. So I guess at times then you're still doubting yourself and when it's going to happen, but you've got to understand it's a process as well. I probably wanted everything yesterday instead of tomorrow, so I was always someone that was in a hurry for it to happen, and probably frustrated me at times when it didn't happen soon enough, or soon enough for me anyway.
And how did you get over those moments? Did you just tell yourself that you will make it? Did you have to be patient or what?
Yeah, you have to be patient. Probably it made me work harder too. I remember, if I had bad losses, I still can remember pushing myself, whether it was hard that afternoon after a bad loss, even in junior tournaments, or the next day for sure. And I would try and, get it out of my mind as quickly as possible and move on to the next event.
Part of your tennis education was Peter Smith's setup in Adelaide, a remarkable tennis coach. He had so many of the Australian greats, including a couple of people who ended up, one coaching you, Darren Cahill, and another contemporary of Cahill's, Peter Carter, ended up coaching Roger Federer. What did you pick up from Smith's setup?
Well, Smithy was an unbelievable technical coach. So I was very fortunate that my parents sourced him out So I started with him when I was 6. And I had sessions with him right through until I was 16, basically, and went on the tour, and I've had a great relationship with him ever since. But, yeah, he was a tough taskmaster, though, Smithy. Yeah, he didn't really care about results. It was all about the technique and trying to get that right from a young age. And there were certain times, numerous Sunday morning sessions, that I felt like I was doing it right, but he would, stop the ball, walk down my end and demonstrate yet again that no, I'm not doing it right. And it was a lot of talking in those sessions, I remember, but I didn't miss one Sunday morning session for the whole over 10 years that I was coached by Peter in Adelaide. And I look back now and just think how fortunate, because he set me up with that mindset that I had to keep improving, keep striving to get better.
We know that champions are stubborn, so did the young Lleyton Hewitt happily take his strictness, or did you sometimes rebel against it?
No, not with Peter at all. I think I just believed in the process that Peter was going through and had the utmost respect for him and what he was teaching me as well. And, there were certain stages, I had a lot of squad sessions and stuff in Adelaide as well, but my main tennis sessions and working on my technique and my development was with Peter. And so I kind of put all my trust in him in a lot of ways.
You had this really good run when you were 18, 19. You got into the Davis Cup team. You did incredibly well. You beat Todd Martin in the Davis Cup centenary match. You played an awful lot of tennis then, but I remember one of your stock responses was, "I'm 19, I don't get tired." Was that true, or was that just a good line?
No, I felt like at that age that, you could run through a brick wall and then the next day you'd be fine. Whether that was my genes as well, I don't know, because I don't remember having a whole heap of physio and treatment and stuff like that I certainly needed in the second half of my career. So it's... I think at that age, you just, it's like playing junior tournaments. You play 2 or 3 matches in the one day. And I was just able to do that. And I still remember, the match against Todd was brutal conditions in Boston at the Longwood Cricket Club there in my first Davis Cup match. It was so hot. We had the American president, George Bush, Senior there, and also John Howard at the time at the match, who was our Prime Minister of Australia. And it was a surreal moment for me for the first time getting my gold jacket and playing for Australia and playing singles alongside Pat Rafter, but then having John Newcombe and Tony Roach as my captain and coach as well. So I was very fortunate to be surrounded by champions of the game. I think physically, I felt like I could play all day back then.
Because you pulled it off. I mean, what made you pull off? You've just described so many potential obstacles. Davis Cup debut, still a teenager. What allowed you to pull it off?
Well, I'd been groomed for Davis Cup. So I had been an Orange boy 2 or 3 occasions before that as a 15, 16-year-old. And then I was the 5th player. There was only 4 players in a team back then, and I was the 5th player probably 3 or 4 other times as well, where I travelled to Zimbabwe and all these other ties around Australia. But at the time, we had Rafter, Philippoussis and the Woodies. We had a pretty good team on paper, but we hadn't actually been able to win it. And so it took Mark Philippoussis actually getting injured at Wimbledon against Pete Sampras. And so we had the Davis Cup tie 2 weeks later in Boston. And that's when Nuke said, "Mate, you're getting the call up, you're playing." And he said, "You're ready. You've done your apprenticeship. You're ready to take it on now." And having the belief from those kind of guys, that just instilled the belief that I was good enough.
So you picked up the gravitas of their reputation, of Newcombe, Roach and everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. To think that those guys have been to the pinnacle of the game. I'd seen what they'd done with Pat Rafter in terms of he was just a so-so player, especially through juniors, but also the first part of his career as well. And then Roachy and Newcombe really turned him into the player he was, where he went on to win US Opens, finals of Wimbledon, got to world number 1. And I remember sitting in the car with Pat and just a drive to practice one day. We were in Boston and we were both in the back seat, and he was just sort of basically telling me or getting me to believe that I was good enough to win these big Davis Cup matches. And you have someone like that telling you that's been there and done it, that just kind of reinforced to me. And I guess, I come back to people knowing my personality and what was going to push me the right way. And those people that got the most out of me were certainly Nuke, Roachy, Pat Rafter, John Fitzgerald, these guys that knew me better than anyone and how I was going to respond to certain situations.
So what did it mean to you at the end of 1999 in Nice, indoor clay, to win the Davis Cup?
It meant an awful lot, but it's something that, I don't want to say I took for granted, but I didn't realise how tough it was to win in Davis Cup. You only work that out in later years. Like my first 5 years on the tour, I played in 4 Davis Cup finals out of the 5 years. And you look back now and you think, gee, how hard was it to do that? Like, it was pretty remarkable. We won that Davis Cup final and Pat wasn't in the team, so there was a certain sadness or disappointment about that, because he was someone who I knew all he wanted to do was win the Davis Cup, and he was part of the journey, absolutely, but he wasn't in the team in the actual final, so there was still that disappointment or loss because of that. But at the end of the day, the Davis Cup and winning for your country is bigger than any individual. And so, if you've played a small part over the years, then you are part of that winning team in my mind, and especially Pat and what he did in Boston as well. And in the first round of that year, he played a massive part in us winning the Davis Cup in '99.
Tennis Worthy is not just a podcast. It's also a video series dedicated to the triumphs and challenges Hall of Famers and legends have overcome. From Arthur Ashe to Billie Jean King's resiliency and Martina Navratilova's sacrifice of defecting from her homeland for a better future, Tennis Worthy tells the best stories of the game from the best players in the game through the defining values of tennis. To watch, visit tennisfame.com/tennisworthy. When you shop at tennisfame.com, you're supporting the International Tennis Hall of Fame's mission to preserve tennis history, celebrate its greatest champions, and inspire tennis fans around the world. The shop is stocked with the best gifts for the tennis fan in your life, from performance Fila apparel, hats, tees, and more. Shop now at shoptennisfame.com. Let's send it back now to Chris Bowers for more of his conversation with Hall of Famer Lleyton Hewitt.
Your Grand Slam and world number one period began the second half of 2001. How important was winning the Davis Cup in '99, reaching the Wimbledon mixed doubles final in 2000, and winning the US Open men's doubles title in 2000 in preparing you for being a singles champion?
Obviously, the Davis Cup, playing in those big matches before beating Guga, moments like that and going through those nerves of playing in big matches and helped me prepare for, the pointy end of Grand Slam tournaments. Winning the US Open doubles with Max Mirny in 2000, which absolutely came out of the blue. I wasn't going to play doubles that particular week, and Sandon Stolle, who I played some doubles tournaments with and was a great mate of mine, he was good mates with Max Mirny, and Max didn't have a partner. And Sandon was basically pleading with me just to sign up and play with Max that week. And I said, no, I'm not doing it. And then he basically said, well, Max doesn't have anyone, so can you at least sign in with him? If it gets too hard for your singles, then you can pull out. And so that was the agreement basically going into it. It just worked out so well that I was continuing in winning my singles matches, making it through to the semi-finals that year of the singles, the US Open. But we were playing on all my off days, the doubles matches, so I never had to back up. It just worked out scheduling really well. Max and I sort of came in at the start with no real pressure or expectation, I guess. And in the second round, we played the Woodies. We ended up beating them. That was they were the number one seeds, the world number ones. And that was their last doubles match together in a Grand Slam. So I quite often bring that up, especially to Teddy. But we won 7-6 in the third in a tie break. And, we didn't really look back after that, Max and I. It was the only time we played together.
If you think of the US Open 2001... at the time, everyone said, oh, well, it's a top-heavy draw. And by the time it got to the final, Sampras was a red-hot favourite against you. And yet, you played out of your skin.
Yeah, I got better and better as the tournament went on. In the semi-finals, no one probably talks about it that much. But in terms of a ball-striking match, I don't know if I've ever hit the ball better. I beat Evgeny Kafelnikov in the semis in very convincing fashion in straight sets. And I just felt like I couldn't miss, to be honest. So being able to take that was on the Saturday afternoon where you had to back up and play the final the day after straight away. So for me, I felt very confident in how I was hitting the ball going into that final. It was more about whether you can control your emotions and the pressure that comes with playing in a Grand Slam final. But I was pretty excited as well to get the opportunity to play Pete Sampras, a guy that I idolised and looked up to. I was going in as the underdog. He was the favourite in that final. So, that took a little bit of the pressure off, I guess, going into that one as well. And I wasn't really that nervous. I was more nervous about the coin toss when I went up for that, because Pete was standing on the other side of the net that I'm about to play, and I actually had Ivan Lendl doing the coin toss for the final. And so for me, that was a surreal moment. These are two guys that I idolise, yet I'm about to play in a US Open final here against one of them, and the other bloke's tossing the coin for us. So, it was an amazing... I quite often look back at that photo still and can't believe I was in that position.
So how did you control your emotions?
I think having the belief that I was good enough to be there, and having the belief in how I was playing, and that I'd beaten Pete before as well. I'd beaten him on grass at Queen's. So that had given me a lot of confidence going into that match. I knew how well my return of serve was, which was going to be so important, return of serve and passing shots on that particular match. But yeah, the big talking point, I guess, going in was Pete hadn't been broken serve for so many games going in. I can't remember what it was now, but I remember in the press conference all the American journalists talking about how he can't be broken, and I kind of just dismissed it, didn't really think too much of it. And then I was returning first game, and I broke him in the opening game. And that's kind of when I said to myself, okay, well, no one else can break him, but I can. And I got broken the very next game, so it went back to 1-1, and then went on serve for the rest of the first set. But I was able to play a very clean tiebreak, and I won that first set in the tiebreak. And from there, I just felt like Pete had some doubt in his mind, and that's when I really just tried to up it from there. And I hardly remember missing a return of serve or a passing shot for the match, which, you kind of feel like you're playing out of your skin in some way. It was an out of body experience. So yeah, it was something very special.
One of the least remembered parts of that final is it was just 38 hours before 9/11. Had you left the city by the time the plane hit the Twin Towers?
Yes, the following morning after I won the US Open, you have to do the rounds of media and talk shows and all that. But I had to get back we had a Davis Cup semi-final in Sydney. They were playing Sweden the following weekend. So I had to try and get out of there as soon as possible. So after doing all that media stuff, I was on the flight roughly around 6 o'clock out of New York on the Monday evening. So I flew across from New York to LA and then took the connection from LA to Sydney, and 9/11 happened on the Tuesday morning, I think between 8 and 9 o'clock, maybe something that time. So that happened while we were actually flying on the LA to Sydney flight at the time. It was weird because there was press conferences and everything meant to be happening as soon as I landed in Sydney. But as soon as we touched down in Sydney Airport, the Federal Australian Police came on the plane and said that nobody could leave, and we had to fill out all forms, and said there'd been something had happened over in New York Airport, and everyone had to fill out forms to whether they saw anything before we left from New York. And you couldn't fathom how things had changed within that 12 hours, basically, since I'd been there. And walking around the streets of New York, and obviously the press conference, everything got cancelled in Australia, and it was a really weird moment for me, to be honest, after being on such a high, and then now having questions about a lot of the people that I'd celebrated with as well, just 24 hours before, because I knew they were doing all the tourist things in New York, and what had happened around the World Trade Center. Yeah, it was It was a tough period in my life, to be honest. Yeah.
Did it dampen the sense of success?
It puts everything into perspective, I guess. And the US Open was just a tennis tournament in a lot of ways. But, I had celebrated with some Australian rules football players that were over there, just pot luck. They were on their end-of-season trip. So they came out. They were at the final when I beat Pete, and then they came out and celebrated with me on the Sunday night. And I knew they were going to be going out and going to the World Trade. They were actually on their way that morning when it happened. So there was just a lot of thoughts and worries about, the people that were all caught up in that. And even that next year when I went back to defend my title, to think that, the next time I went back to New York, it had totally changed.
You ended the year as world number one. You did that in Sydney because the Tennis Masters Cup, the name then given to the ATP Finals, was moved to Sydney at fairly short notice. That must have been an immense satisfaction for you.
Yeah, it was something I remember Pat Rafter and I talking about, that we both wanted to make sure we qualify for the top 8 that year once it had been decided it was going to be in Sydney. It was pretty special to both be there, playing in Sydney in our tour finals. The best players from that whole year in 2001 getting the chance to play against each other. And for me, just to get the opportunity going into that Masters Cup, there was 3 of us, myself, Gustavo Kuerten and Andre Agassi, that could finish the year world number 1, depending on results at the end of that event. And so that was, it was a lot of pressure going into that as well, knowing that that was a massive carrot dangling at the end of the tournament, because it's not a normal tournament either. It's the round robin situation, and you can still get through to the semi-finals even if you lose, one of your opening round robin matches. So you had to try and control your emotions for that as well.
And for the 3rd year running, you ended the year in the Davis Cup final. This one, a rare one, on grass at the Rod Laver Arena against the French.
Yeah, it was the following week after the Masters Cup. So it was really demanding that end of year. I was able to win the Masters Cup, but I actually strained my hamstring in the match against Pat, which not many people knew about, in the second set. That match would end up seeing me clinch world number 1, but I had a semi-final and final still to play at the Masters Cup. I was awfully close to pulling out against Juan Carlos Ferrero in the semi-final. Half of my team was telling me that I should be pulling out, and the other half was saying, no, you've got to this stage, you've got to try and give it a go. I played with a lot of tape on my leg for the next 2 days. I'm glad I was able to go out there and win the Masters Cup. It was something very special to do it in Sydney after just being crowned world number 1, but it certainly hurt going out there and playing the Davis Cup final only a few days later on grass.
The following year, you won Wimbledon. Remarkable achievement. Probably the first player, perhaps since Agassi, to win it totally from the back of the court. How do you look back on that Wimbledon tournament, and in particular that achievement?
Well, it's one of my proudest moments. Wimbledon growing up in Australia was seen as the biggest tournament there is in tennis in our sport. Especially Australians had done so well in the past at Wimbledon on grass, and my mindset playing on grass changed probably a year or 2 before that. Up until then in juniors, and even when I first started playing on grass in the seniors, I was still looking to try and come to the net, serve volley a certain amount of times. It got to the stage where I think I had success at Queen's Club pretty much the year before, 2 years before in 2000, and I basically backed my returns against the best servers in the world and decided to play grass court tennis on my terms. I drew inspiration from looking at a guy like Andre Agassi and how he was able to do it at his best and beat one of the biggest servers in the game, who was Goran Ivanisevic at the time, in a final of Wimbledon from the back of the court. And so my mindset was, in terms of playing on grass, it actually helped my serve because I got a little bit more pop out of the court. So if I could control my service games and hold my service games, then it was going to build pressure on my opponents. And then I backed my return of serve, especially when I was at the peak of the game, to get enough opportunities to break anyone in the world. And that's what I focused on. And so coming into that Wimbledon, I played extremely well in Queens. I was undefeated on grass going into Wimbledon, but I felt really confident and capable that, going out there, I was the best grass court player in the world at that stage. And in the end, the semi-final was probably built up as the final in a lot of ways because it was against Tim Henman, my old foe. We played a lot of matches. It was Australia against England. It was a battle of the Ashes. But once again, it was played with the massive crowd going for Tim, and I love that situation. So in a lot of ways, it played into my hands very nicely.
You spent the whole of 2002 as world number 1. That is a phenomenal achievement if you think that rankings reflect consistency. Do you think that people give you the credit for that kind of achievement warrants?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't often think about it too often, to be honest. But yeah, to start number 1 for a whole year is it's not easy because guys like Federer, Nadal, Djokovic have made it look easy the last 10 years or so, or even longer, 15 years now. But it's certainly not easy because there's a target on your back every single week. And so, you are the hunted basically out there. And so that makes it a totally different mindset when you go on the court every single time. So that's what when you see those three guys that I just spoke about, that's what makes their careers so incredible, because they've basically had to deal with that every week for their whole careers. But for me, 2002, it was a frustrating start to the year, because I actually felt like I was playing the best tennis of anyone in the world, even on hard court at the start of the year, and then I got chickenpox at the Hopman Cup. And so I went out in the Australian Open and couldn't compete properly. And then it took me a couple of months to get over the chickenpox. And so that was a rough time for me, mentally, but also physically, getting back to that level that I had to compete, which probably not a lot of people knew about at the time. So that's what made it all the more special to win Wimbledon as well, and finish the year number one, knowing that I wasn't able to play that early part of the year.
There's two matches with Federer I'd just like to ask you about, both on the Rod Laver Arena. Davis Cup semi-final of 2003. Australia were 2-1 up, but Federer led you by 2 sets and 5-3. And somehow you managed to come back. And you barely played any tennis in the second half of that year. You had a bunion, I think, that was treated. And you went on to win the Davis Cup final. What was it you were able to tap into from 2 sets to love and 5-3 down to beat the newly crowned Wimbledon champion and somebody that everyone recognised was just a sublime talent?
Yeah, there was certainly self-belief. I didn't doubt myself. I still, even when I was in that situation and Roger was playing unbelievable, I still believed that I was only a few points away from somehow turning that match around. Up until that stage, I didn't think Roger had done anything wrong. I didn't feel like I was playing badly, but I still felt like there was still a bit of tennis left in that particular match if I could break it 5-3, and I was able to do that. Whether he got a little bit nervous trying to close it out at that stage. But I remember, coming to that change of ends and Fitzy sitting down and just telling me, mate, there's a long way left in this match, and I was 4 points away, or at one stage I was 2 points away from losing the match. And so just that positive reinforcement that, I felt like the longer the match went, it played into my favour as well, fitness-wise, and then also just using the crowd to get behind me as the match went on. And I have so many memories, though, of Pat Cash coming back and beating Mikhail Pernfors in '86 in the Davis Cup final. I've watched that match, I don't know, over 100 times at Kooyong there on the grass court. And for me, I just had visions of that. That's all I wanted to do one day, was do that. And this was my version and my opportunity to be able to do it. And after I won the third set, I honestly believed I was going to win that match. From that stage forward, I won the tie break, but I'd look at Roger and I saw some doubt in his mind. And even though the fourth set went tight and it ended up 7-5, I broke him to win it. I still felt like I was in control, and then there was no way I was going to lose once it went to a fifth.
There were a lot of come-ons. You were known for your come-ons and your two gestures when you won big points, the lawnmower and the logo gesture, the flat hand up by the forehead. Did they just come naturally, or were they calculated? I know there's one guy at the Australian Open, an Argentinian player, who took exception when you did that, when he made mistakes. But was that part of your tactics, or was it a totally natural expression of where you were?
Yeah, no, it was never something I ever thought about doing. It purely just came out in emotion at the time, depending on the situation and how I was feeling. The actual sign, it's called the Visht, and it was actually Mats Wilander was the first to do it. So it actually came from Mats, and I used to go to the Australian Open and I actually watched Mats do it to his Swedish fans back then as a kid growing up. So, I just started copying it and doing it in junior tournaments. I don't even know who I was doing it to. And then it just gradually came on the tour. So I was lucky Mats had retired by the time that I came along, that I never had to play him, because that would have been embarrassing. There's no way I would have been able to do it if I had to play Mats. But he was a guy that I idolised growing up. His game style, how he went about it. He was able to win the Australian Open. And that's where it sort of started from. But it was never something that I ever did to try and rattle my opponent. It was more purely my end of the court and showing the emotion of what I was feeling at the time. And I always played my best tennis when I was pumped up and playing with a lot of emotion and energy.
The other match against Federer was fourth round of the Australian Open 2004, when he got the better of you, I think for the first time, certainly for the first time in a major tournament. And in looking back on that, it's almost like the end of your peak years, the era maybe when Roger and within a couple of years Rafa took over the mantle that you'd had. How do you look back on that fourth round match in 2004?
I don't remember a whole heap about it, to be honest.
Remember the fireworks going off?
Yeah, at times. Oh, yeah, there was quite a lot. It must have been Australia Day, was it? Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, it happened nearly every year I was playing. But, yeah, for me, there were certain stages, obviously, where, Roger, up until that point, I'd had the better of him. He'd won a couple of times, I think, against me, but not in the bigger matches. But we all knew what he was capable of doing, and that's sort of the start of when he made his exceptional run, basically, and dominated the sport for the next 10 years or so. So, yeah, it was a matter, I think he got the self-belief in himself that he was able to do it against players. And up until that point, I was probably the one guy that he'd really struggled with, especially head-to-head. And he certainly made up for that. After that, I lost a lot of big matches to him, including the US Open final, where he destroyed me in straight sets later that year in 2004. And, yeah, he really went from strength to strength after that.
You got to the Australian Open final in 2005. It's the centenary Australian Open. That must have been a very proud moment. How does that compare with the two slams that you won, even though you lost the final to Marat Safin?
Yeah, well, it's a proud moment. More so because I got no regrets. I absolutely left everything out there. I won Sydney the week before, but I actually had a bit of a hip problem during the Sydney tournament. And so it was really, no one knew that going into the Australian Open, and I felt like every match was kind of an epic match for me, that whole Australian Open run in 2005.
You had a five-setter against Nadal.
Yeah, that was in the fourth round. But if you actually look at my draw, apart from not playing Federer at any stage in the tournament, I'd say that was my hardest draw that I'd ever played in a Grand Slam. I played Arnaud Clément first round, second round James Blake, who was not seeded, third round Juan Ignacio Chela, Rafa in a fourth round, now Bandy in a quarter, Roddick in a semi, and then Safin in a final. So if you actually look at the names of guys, even Arnaud Clément in the first round, who had been a finalist of the Australian Open not that long before, I felt like that was probably as hard a draw as you'll ever be given. And it felt like every match was an epic encounter for me, and I wasn't able to practice on my days off in between matches, but I was just riding this massive wave of emotion from the Australian public, to be honest. It felt like the whole country was behind me for those 2 weeks, and yeah, I was able to leave it all out there. I came slightly short in the end against Marat, who was just too good on the day. But yeah, it was an unbelievable feeling to finally get through to an Australian Open final, and something that I'd worked extremely hard in that off season as well. At the end of the 2004 season, in the pre-season, I'd done as much work as I'd ever done off the court to give myself a chance of winning it.
You carried on playing singles for another 11 years after that. You retired at the 2016 Australian Open. Looking back, do you think you should have achieved more beyond 2005, or do you think actually that what you achieved between 99 and, say, the beginning of 2004 was an incredibly phenomenal body of work?
Potentially, maybe I could have, especially 06, 07, 08, those kind of years. But then after that, I had some body issues, and the surgeries really set me back in a lot of ways. But I love the sport of tennis, and I love competing, and I love pushing myself to try and get the most out of myself. But the second half of my career was certainly hard because it was a lot more stop-start. Towards the end of my career, I played with a foot problem that the surgery just... the first surgery I had didn't fix it, and then I continued on for 4 or 5 years before ending up having the fusion in the toe, because no one was 100% sure that I was going to be able to play again. But it got to a stage that bad that I had no choice but to go down that path. In the end, I wish I did that 5 years earlier, had that surgery, because I felt like I would have been playing pain-free, and I would have been able to train off the court the way that I wanted to train, which was probably the most frustrating thing for me because I love competing, but I felt like I couldn't prepare as well to go out and compete purely because my body wasn't able to do that.
You then became Davis Cup captain. Given how passionate you were as a player for Australia, how does it feel to be Davis Cup captain?
Yeah, it's an incredible honour because the guys that I've had as captains, especially Nuke, Fitzy and Pat Rafter, have done everything for Australian tennis. So I feel like it's a massive responsibility for me to be there, and I'm really just trying to do the same as what Nuke and Roche did for me. And I feel like I've been able to do that, especially with some of the younger guys coming through now. Alex Diminar, for example, will do absolutely anything for the Australian Davis Cup team and for his teammates and his country. And that's what, the history and tradition, we're very fortunate to come from a country that has that. And really just trying to pass that on to these younger guys now and getting them wanting to play Davis Cup and win as a team. And there's something really special, even though the Davis Cup competition's still changed in a lot of ways. Playing for your country, there is no greater honour. So I feel very fortunate to have that responsibility, and it's not something that I take lightly.
When you said that Newcombe, Roach and Fitzgerald really understood you, are you able to bring some of that psychological knowledge that you learnt from them to understanding some of the less easy Australians available for selection?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's something I've had to work on as well, because taking over the team from straight out of playing, there's certain expectations that you expect from players, I guess, in terms of how you trained and how you went about it, and just understanding all the different personalities and how they tick and what motivates them and how best I can motivate and inspire them to get them to the level they need to be when they go out to play. That's a challenge, and it's not easy, and that's where you've got to know your players inside out, basically, and what makes them tick, and that's something you continue to work at, and just having that bond or that trust with those players as well, because when you're out there, there's certain pressures and expectations that if you haven't played Davis Cup or haven't played for your country, you people wouldn't know what that is or what it feels like. And so knowing how to deal with them when they're under pressure or under stress, that's something that I continue to work at.
At your peak as a Davis Cup player, there was a move towards getting team colours. The clothing company you were with at the time was resisting that. I gather you one day went with your agent and dyed a number of shirts gold and a number of pairs of shorts green because you were so keen to play in the gold and baggy green of Australia.
Yeah, I think, going back, I think I was the first one to do it, to be honest. And it was something that I wanted to do badly, was play. And I think it's got something to do, growing up and watching cricket and guys getting to represent in their colours. And I think it's something great about the team competition that you can do that. And so, I was a big advocate to try and have that put in. And it's something pretty special when you look back now and see all the other teams wearing it and with their country name on the back of their shirt. And I think it tops it off nicely.
You talked about getting the gold blazer of Australia. You're now getting the blazer of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. What does it mean to you to be a Hall of Famer?
It's an incredible honour and something that makes me really proud to think, it's something as a player I never ever thought of, being inducted into the Hall of Fame, or something I always looked up to. My idols, they belonged in there, and not something I ever strove to try and make it into the Hall of Fame. I just tried to get the absolute most out of myself, and to walk through the museum here in Newport and see some of my memorabilia up with the likes of Verlander, Edberg, Lendl, all the greats of the game, and then I go back and see Nuke and Roche and all the top Australians. It gives you goosebumps, to be honest. Something I'm extremely proud of. I've always loved the history of the sport, and to somehow have had a small part in that now is something really special. You've
got your own kids. You deal with plenty of kids on tennis courts. What advice do you give them? What advice do you feel most comfortable giving young players?
Oh, first of all, you've got to enjoy it. You've got to enjoy the journey of being a tennis player. Otherwise, you'll never fulfill your potential. But I think always to have no excuses, to go out there and lay it on the line, give 100% all the time. I think you'll have no regrets when you look back at the end of your career, and I think that's the biggest thing, is every single time you step onto a tennis court, whether it's on the practice court or the match court, to try and get the most out of yourself.
Lleyton Hewitt, thank you for sharing your recollections with us.
No worries. Thanks, mate.
A big thank you to Lleyton for today's tennis-worthy conversation. If you like what you heard, please share this show with somebody who's interested in a winning mindset in Australian pride, Davis Cup, or the game of tennis in general. The greatest compliment you can give us is to share this show with those you care about. Tennis Worthy Podcast was created by the International Tennis Hall of Fame in association with the Tennis Radio Network. Thanks for listening. We look forward to having you back next time.